Private Takeshi Yamamoto had not cried since he was 7 years old. Not when his father died, not when he left home for military service, not through 2 years of jungle warfare in the Solomon Islands, not even when the American Marines overran his position, and he became the thing he had been taught was worse than death, a prisoner. But now, sitting at a long wooden table in Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, holding something called a hamburger in both hands, Takeshi felt tears running down his face and could not stop them. The shame was overwhelming. Not shame at crying, though that was part of it. Shame at the fact that he was eating better as a prisoner of war than his family was eating as free citizens of the Japanese Empire. Shame that every bite of this strange American food proved that everything the Emperor had told him about the enemy was a lie. Let me tell you what happened to Takeshi and thousands of Japanese prisoners like him, because this is not a story about food. This is a story about how kindness can be more devastating than any weapon. How abundance can break what bullets cannot touch, and how sometimes the cruelest thing you can do to an enemy is treat them with unexpected humanity. September 1944. The bus convoy rolled through the gates of Camp McCoy, carrying 47 Japanese prisoners of war. Most had been captured on Saipan, a few from Guam. All of them were certain they were about to die. The Imperial Japanese Army had taught them that capture was the ultimate disgrace. Death before dishonor was not a slogan. It was an expectation enforced by military law and cultural pressure going back centuries. But more than that, they had been taught specific things about what Americans did to prisoners. The propaganda had been explicit and brutal. Americans tortured captives for information. They mutilated bodies. They shot prisoners for sport. American soldiers were descended from criminals and savages who knew nothing of honor or bushido. Surrender meant not just death, but degradation. Better to die fighting or commit suicide than face what the Americans would do. Yet here Takeshi sat, still alive 3 weeks after his capture, still confused about why. The bus stopped. Guards opened the doors. The prisoners filed out slowly, their hands bound with rope that seemed almost casual in its looseness. No beatings, no rifles striking backs. Just quiet instructions in broken Japanese from an interpreter. Line up. Walk forward. Do not run. The camp looked like any military installation. Barracks, guard towers, barbed wire. But the atmosphere was strange. Guards stood watching but not menacing. No one shouted. No one struck anyone. A Red Cross official stood near the processing building, clipboard in hand. His presence shocked the prisoners. They had been told the Red Cross was propaganda, a fiction designed to make Americans seem civilized, yet here was a man in a Red Cross uniform, checking that the prisoners were being processed according to written rules. Actually checking, actually enforcing standards. The medical examination was the first real surprise. American doctors, working through interpreters, examined each prisoner carefully. They checked for wounds, malnutrition, disease. Takeshi stood on a scale and watched the needle settle far below where it should. He had lost 40 pounds since leaving Japan. His ribs showed clearly through his skin. The American doctor shook his head and made notes. Through the interpreter he said simply, "We will fix this," not as a threat, as a promise. The prisoners were given clean uniforms. Not rags or prison stripes, but actual clothing. Sturdy fabric marked with PW, but otherwise well-made and warm. They were shown to barracks that had heated stoves and actual beds, not concrete floors or wooden planks, but cots with mattresses. Takeshi sat on his cot carefully, as if afraid it might disappear. Around him, other prisoners whispered nervously. "This cannot be real," one said. "This is temporary. They are preparing us for something worse." Another disagreed. Maybe they want us to tell our families how well we are treated. Psychological warfare. But the strangest part came that evening at dinner time. The prisoners were marched to a mess hall that smelled like nothing Takeshi had experienced in 2 years. The smell of real food. Meat, fat, bread. They lined up with tin trays, following guards who seemed more interested in keeping order than in intimidation. The serving line moved them past American soldiers in kitchen whites, who were actually serving food. Real food. Takeshi watched the man ahead of him receive a plate with what the interpreter called a hamburger. A piece of meat between 2 pieces of bread. Alongside it, fried potatoes, a vegetable, and a bottle of something dark and fizzing. Then it was his turn. The server, a young black soldier with kind eyes, placed the same portions on Takeshi's tray. The hamburger was still warm. The smell of cooked beef hit him like a physical force. His stomach cramped with hunger so intense it was painful. He carried his tray to a table and sat down slowly. Around him, the other prisoners were having the same experience. Some were frozen, staring at their food as if it might attack them. Others ate with desperate speed, as if someone might take it away. Take your hamburger with both hands. It was heavy. 6 months. He took a small bite, afraid of what it might taste like, afraid it might be poisoned or drugged. It tasted like everything he had forgotten about being human. The beef was rich and fatty. The bread was soft. The combination was so overwhelming that Takeshi had to put the hamburger down and just breathe for a moment. That was when the tears started. He tried to stop them, tried to maintain discipline and honor, but the contrast was too great. 6 months ago, he had been eating watery rice and whatever he could scavenge in the jungle. His unit had been on half rations for a year. Many had died of malnutrition before the Americans even attacked. Back home in Osaka, his mother and sister were surviving on rations that grew smaller every month. The letters he had received before capture spoke of hunger as a constant companion. And now he sat as a prisoner, eating beef. In America. The bottle next to his tray was labeled Coca-Cola. The interpreter explained it was a drink, very sweet. Takeshi opened it carefully. The carbonation hissed. He took a small sip. The sweetness exploded in his mouth. Not the gentle sweetness of fruit, but something concentrated and artificial and completely unlike anything Japanese cuisine included. He gasped. The carbonation burned his throat. But underneath that burn was sugar. Real sugar. Something he had not tasted since 1942. Around him, other prisoners were having similar reactions. Some laughed at the strange sensation. Others coughed. One man held the bottle up to the light, studying it as if it were some kind of magic potion. Sergeant Kenji Sato, an older soldier who had been captured on Guam, spoke quietly in Japanese. They want us to forget we are soldiers. They want to make us soft. We must resist. But even as he said it, Sato took another bite of his hamburger, because resistance meant nothing in the face of actual hunger being satisfied. That night, lying on his cot under a real blanket in a heated barracks, Takeshi tried to make sense of what was happening. Everything he had been taught about America said they were weak, decadent, a mongrel nation of different races who could not work together, a society collapsing under its own contradictions. Yet the evidence before him told a different story. The Americans had so much food they could afford to feed prisoners better than Japan fed its own soldiers. They had so many resources they could heat barracks and provide medical care and follow written rules even for enemies. And most troubling of all, they treated prisoners with a casual dignity that suggested this was normal for them. Not special effort for propaganda purposes. Just how they operated. The contradictions were overwhelming. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. 3 meals a day, every day. Meat at almost every meal, vegetables, bread, and always the Coca-Cola. The prisoners were assigned to work details, not punishing labor but actual work that needed doing. Repairing equipment, helping on nearby farms, building projects within the camp. And they were paid small amounts in camp script that could be used at the canteen to buy toiletries, writing paper, even candy. The concept of paying prisoners for their labor was incomprehensible to Takeshi. White, in the Imperial Army, soldiers did what they were told because orders were orders. Payment was irrelevant. But here, the Americans treated work as something that deserved compensation, even from prisoners. The canteen was another shock, a small store inside the camp where prisoners could purchase items with their earned scrip. Chocolate, cigarettes, magazines. Takeshi saved his scrip for 2 weeks and then bought a chocolate bar. He held it in his hands for several minutes before unwrapping it. In Japan, chocolate like this was medicine. Expensive, rare, given to sick children or wounded soldiers. Here it was candy, something prisoners could buy casually with money earned from a few hours of work. He ate it slowly, making it last. And with each bite, his understanding of the war shifted slightly. If America could give chocolate to prisoners, what did that say about American industrial capacity? About their resource base? About the fundamental economic reality underlying the war? The letters from home made the contradictions even sharper. When prisoners were allowed to write and receive mail, censored but permitted, the news from Japan painted a picture of increasing desperation. Takeshi received a letter from his sister describing how their mother fainted from hunger while standing in a ration line, how they were eating grass and bark to supplement their official food allowance, how entire neighborhoods in Osaka had been flattened by American bombers. He read this letter while holding a half-eaten hamburger in his other hand. The juxtaposition was obscene. His sister was starving in Osaka. He was eating beef in Wisconsin. The guards at Camp McCoy were an endless source of confusion. They enforced rules, yes, they maintained order, but they did so without the casual cruelty that had been normal in the Imperial Army. One guard, a farm boy from Iowa named Miller, actually showed Takeshi photographs of his family during a work break. His mother, his 2 sisters, his girlfriend back home. The gesture was so human, so ordinary, that Takeshi did not know how to process it. This was supposed to be the enemy, the savage Americans who knew nothing of honor or civilization. Yet here was Miller, sharing family photos with a Japanese prisoner, as if they were just 2 young men far from home. Another time, during a particularly cold morning work detail, a different guard shared his coffee with the prisoners, just poured extra cups and handed them around. No ceremony, no propaganda purpose, just a small kindness on a cold day. These moments accumulated, small gestures that individually meant little but collectively challenged everything Takeshi thought he knew about Americans. The food became a kind of psychological warfare, far more effective than any interrogation. Not because it was withheld, but because it was freely given. Every meal was proof that America had abundance Japan could not match. Every hamburger was evidence that the propaganda had been lies. Every bottle of Coca-Cola demonstrated that the enemy was not weak or collapsing, but possessed resources beyond Japanese imagination. And the prisoners could not help but make comparisons. They whispered to each other at night, careful conversations about what this meant. If the Americans can afford to feed prisoners like this, one man said, what are they feeding their own soldiers? What does their civilian population eat? Another responded bitterly, more than our emperor, probably. Such statements would have been unthinkable before capture. Treasonous. grounds for execution. But here in Wisconsin, surrounded by evidence that contradicted every official story, the prisoners were beginning to question. Not openly, not loudly, but the doubt was there, growing with each meal. By spring 1945, news began filtering into the camp about Japan's situation. The fall of Iwo Jima, the bombing of Tokyo, the obvious trajectory toward Japanese defeat. The prisoners gathered around radios, listening to news broadcasts translated by interpreters. Some refused to believe Japan was losing. The emperor was divine. Japan was destined to win. This was all American propaganda. But others, like Takeshi, looked at the food on their plates and the clothes on their backs and the medicine in the infirmary, and they understood something fundamental. Japan had gone to war with a nation it did not understand, a nation whose industrial capacity was not 10 times greater than Japan's, but perhaps 50 times, 100 times. The emperor had told them America was weak, that Americans loved comfort too much to fight hard, that their mongrel society would collapse under pressure. Every part of that assessment was wrong, and the evidence was a hamburger, a bottle of Coca-Cola, and the casual kindness of guards who treated prisoners according to written rules rather than whim. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Japanese prisoners at Camp McCoy reacted with shock. Germany had been Japan's ally, powerful, advanced, the model of military efficiency. If Germany could be defeated, what did that say about Japan's chances? Then in August came news that made no sense at all. 2 cities destroyed by single bombs. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The emperor was going to speak on the radio. The camp commander gathered the prisoners and played the emperor's surrender broadcast. Many prisoners wept. Some refused to believe what they were hearing. The emperor's voice, speaking directly, announcing surrender. It was unthinkable, impossible. The emperor was divine. Japan could not surrender. But the war was over, and for prisoners like Takeshi, that meant facing an uncertain future. Would they be executed now that they were no longer useful? Would they be sent home to disgrace? What waited for them in a defeated Japan? The answer came gradually. The Americans were going to repatriate prisoners, send them home, not as punishment, but simply because the war was over and prisoners should go home. No trials for most, no executions, just transportation back to Japan. The announcement created chaos in Takeshi's mind. They were just letting prisoners go? After all this? After feeding them and housing them and treating them according to rules? When the day came for Takeshi's group to leave Camp McCoy, the prisoners were given clean clothes, medical checkups, and provisions for the journey. At the gate, the camp commander shook each prisoner's hand. Through an interpreter, he said simply, "You fought bravely. Now go home and help rebuild your country." Takeshi stood at the gate, looking back at the camp that had held him for nearly a year, the place where he had expected to die but instead had been fed. The place where he had discovered that everything he thought he knew about his enemy was wrong. A young guard, maybe 19 years old, handed Takeshi a chocolate bar. "For the road," the guard said through the interpreter. Takeshi took it with a bow. He did not know what to say. Thank you seemed inadequate. The ship that carried prisoners back to Japan was crowded and uncomfortable, but it had food. American food. American food. Rations provided by the nation that had defeated them. Takeshi stood on deck as they approached Yokohama Harbor, looking at his homeland for the first time in 3 years. The coast was scarred. Cities were ruins. The contrast with Wisconsin was overwhelming. He returned to Osaka to find his family alive but living in circumstances that made his captivity look comfortable. His mother was thin. His sister was hollow-eyed. Their home had been destroyed in bombing. When his mother asked what captivity had been like, Takeshi struggled to answer. How could he tell her that he had eaten beef while she starved, that the enemy had treated him better than his own government had treated its citizens? He settled for a simple truth. "I survived," he said, "and I learned that we did not know our enemy at all." Years later, Takeshi would tell his children about Camp McCoy, about hamburgers and Coca-Cola, about guards who showed family photos and commanders who shook prisoners' hands. He would explain that war teaches many lessons, but the hardest one is this: your enemy might not be who you think they are. And sometimes, the most devastating weapon is not violence but kindness given freely when you expected none. The hamburger, he would say, was more powerful than any bomb, because it proved that everything we had been told was a lie, and that truth, once learned, could never be unlearned. His grandchildren would ask if he was ashamed of being captured. Takeshi would think carefully before answering. Ashamed of capture, yes, but grateful for what it taught me. I went to war believing in superiority and honor and divine destiny. I came home understanding that honor without truth is meaningless, that superiority based on lies is just arrogance, and that sometimes your enemy can teach you more than your own leaders ever did. The lesson stayed with him forever. That abundance reveals more about a society than scarcity ever can. That rules followed consistently are more powerful than propaganda. That kindness to prisoners is not weakness but evidence of strength so secure it can afford generosity. Japan had taught him that capture was worse than death. America taught him that even enemies deserve dignity. Japan taught him to die for the emperor. America showed him what life looked like in a society that valued human dignity over abstract honor. He never spoke of the war with pride, but he spoke of Camp McCoy with something more complex than gratitude. A kind of painful respect for a nation that had been strong enough to defeat him and humane enough to feed him afterward. The hamburger and Coca-Cola were not just food. They were proof that war is not just about who can kill most effectively, but about what kind of society you build when killing is over. And for prisoners who had expected death and received dinner instead, that lesson was more devastating than any defeat on the battlefield could ever be. Because bullets can be resisted, orders can be followed, but kindness from an enemy you were taught to hate, that changes something inside you that can never be unchanged. And maybe, Takeshi thought in his later years, that was the real victory. Not just defeating Japan militarily, but demonstrating that another way was possible. That even in total war, humanity could survive. That civilization was measured not by how you treated friends, but by how you treated those who had tried to kill you. The taste of that first hamburger stayed with him forever. Not just the flavor, but what it represented. The moment when everything he believed proved false, when the enemy became human, when propaganda shattered against the reality of a hot meal given freely. That taste was the taste of truth, complicated, uncomfortable, undeniable, and it was more powerful than any weapon America possessed.